World Economic Forum Annual Meeting 2023 is being held on the theme Cooperation in a Fragmented World and convene leaders from government, business and civil society to address the state of the world and discuss priorities for the year ahead. The annual meeting provides a platform to engage in constructive, forward-looking dialogues and help find solutions through public-private cooperation. Mr. Wadhwa, what are your expectations given this background from the World Economic Forum 2023?
So the World Economic Forum in 2023, as the topic of this meeting suggests, is about cooperation in a world which is at loggerheads with each other, and we have to ensure that in this situation, solutions are found to the most pressing problems that the world faces. Now, which are these problems? If we look around, we can see that the main issue is how does business prepare for the economic turbulence that is supposed to come around in 2023. And obviously, issues of food security, climate change, mental health and education, they are all on the top of the agenda. All of these affect business. And how does business try and remove trade barriers, especially in the developing world, so that, we can have stimulus for collective act? There are particular problems that the world faces with regard to transition of technology because new technologies are emerging very rapidly on the scene. And how does the developing world in particular prepare for this transition so that it's not left behind and that the new technologies which come around have enough implementers, or in other words, how is the education system revamped to make sure that it produces enough trained workforce to prepare for this transition, and also how it prepares the developing world so that it can go along with the rest of the world and keep up with what's happening in this transition.
Mr. Wadhwa, the meeting is going to be the largest in its history, which might surprise the many skeptics who have written about the end of globalization. Do you interpret this to mean that leaders around the world recognize that globalization needs reimagining, not junking?
I think I completely agree with that sentiment, because globalization is not something that can be done away with. It's there to stay. Of course, you will have, tinkering in the system, in the sense that one trend, for example, which has clearly emerged is that countries are now trying to friendshore the economy, where we had supply chains located in far-flung areas of the world because of economics. Of course, the supply chains will come down in countries which are seen as adversaries. So you will have countries looking for friendly governments and states who they feel they can trust. The second issue is that supply chains will tend to get shorter. So even if the costs are a little bit higher, they would be redesigned in such a manner that countries do not find themselves totally isolated in a spot when there is conflict which comes around with a country which they see as a potential adversary. So that's one trend which will emerge. But secondly, we also have to look at what happens in the multilateral trading system. And that is led in particular by the WTO, where enormous amounts of reforms are needed in the system. And that is why countries have this feeling that the globalization era is in difficulty. But if you bring about reform in the world trading system and you bring down trade barriers, then of course this problem will receive a solution. Most importantly, it is the developed world which has to take the lead in this, because the developing countries already don't have much of a voice in the current day world trading system. And in order for them to have a voice, because the developed world must realize that unless they take the others along, they will be facing much more crises going forward. So the world has become so interconnected nowadays that it is not possible any longer not to have a world system which at least works in some form.
So in support of what you said, two factors come to my mind. One, that no region is an island. Every regional economy depends on the others for vital goods and services, hence globalization. In fact, there's a report by McKinsey which says that the economic ties that bind us are strong and may be impossible to unwind. And secondly, today's biggest challenges don't respect borders. You look at the pandemic that the world faced together, the disruptions that the world faces. So all this says that globalization has to be there. The support of each other has to be there.
I agree with the line of thinking completely, because we've come a long way since we started globalizing and since we started interdependencies. And these interdependencies are very difficult to shrug off. In fact, a number of countries have tried to move their companies out, for example, from China, in particular the United States or even Japan. But that's not been possible to do, at least in the short term. Perhaps in the longer term, these companies will tend to diversify a little bit more and probably invest in other countries instead of putting all their eggs in one basket. But what has been achieved so far is very difficult to remove and to undo. And companies, of course, look for profits. They don't look for politics first. So given that premise, I think we will live in an era of at least a certain amount of globalized world in the near future. I don't see how a fragmented world is going to help in further development. In fact, the more fragmented the world becomes, the worse is going to be the economic situation all around the world.
So cooperation in a fragmented world, the theme that World Economic Forum has, it needs to have, Mr. Wadhwa, resilience, building new muscles for tomorrow. Now, global disruptions isn't slowing down in every arena, as you very rightly pointed out, from geopolitics to food and energy, business as usual is proving to be inadequate. What is your take on this, that resilience is extremely important to build new muscles for tomorrow?
I think businesses need to prepare themselves for the economic turbulence by laying emphasis on climate change and speeding up the green energy transition. They should also concentrate on how to use new technologies so that their business models are revamped in order to increase production. And finally, to pay attention to the healthcare crisis and what is required by way of solutions so that there is collective action taken in that regard. And finally, to work together towards sustainable food systems in order that the world as at large does not have shortages in that regard.
What about sustainability, balancing the energy transition and energy resilience for a net zero future?
Yes, so that's a very important goal for the world. In fact, one of the major focuses at this World Economic Forum is precisely on climate and action towards climate finance, because climate finance has emerged as a very important subject for the developing economies. They don't find themselves in a position to carry out much action in this field unless they get support for this. And so the models that have evolved so far are not considered to be adequate in that regard. So what can the world do to help the countries who are in this situation, who are already reeling from high prices and inflation, and they are also being affected by high energy prices which have resulted from the ongoing Ukraine conflict. So this is the main issue that will be discussed in that particular segment of the World Economic Forum. But there's definitely sustainability is a very important subject at this WEF.
Mr. Wadhwa, we live in a very highly interconnected world. No region is close to being self-sufficient, and about, if I'm not wrong, 40% of global trade is highly concentrated, with just a few nations supplying all the others with some vital products. So do you think we need to reimagine globalization wherein the diversification rather than decoupling plays a major role?
Yes, so this is an issue that has constantly been talked about. What has happened so far in discussions in forums like the G20, for instance, that has been dominated by the developed world, and therefore finding solutions to these kind of problems which are faced mainly in the developing world have not found a focus. For the past 1 year or so, and now with India being in the lead in the G20 and Brazil, which is going to be in the saddle for the next year, we find for the first time three major economies of the developed world taking the lead and trying to find solutions for the developing countries. So hopefully at the end of these 3 years we will find some more focused work in this regard. The World Economic Forum also has a very diverse kind of representation. In fact, there are 130 odd countries who are represented there, predominantly, of course, once again from the developed world. But we find that there are a lot of other voices as well, where there are people who listen to each other, and it is a forum which acts like a sounding board in that regard. More and more countries are now getting aware of sustainability. And sustainability, they feel, can only come about if there is more diversification of trade. So far, the multinational corporations around the world have dominated in world trade. There are major economies, like you said, who dominate trade and are the major suppliers of goods and commodities. That needs to change because the developed world, especially in Africa, for instance, should be able to control much more of the commodity trade so that they get direct benefits from this kind of a system. But how to bring about that is something that whichever forum is talking about it, I will have to pay more attention to.
Thank you so much for your time, Mr. Wadhwa. Thank you for being with All India Radio.
Thank you very much.